I'm gonna hit record now.
I think that's good.
Is it recording?
So is it an actual TOEFL score? Or?
That's a sample score report for the TOEFL. It might be a little outdated. They might look a little bit different now, but it's the same basic information, I believe.
So the score is like for this Tanaka, right?
Mm-hmm.
So is the score 65 out of 100? Or?
Out of 120, yeah, for the TOEFL.
Or no,
I think or spelling or vocabulary.
There are categories for reading skills.
So that's TOEFL.
I know that. I know that one. Range is wide, right? Just like personal perception. I think it's not likely that students can even 37 out of something.
Yeah, we don't know whether it's what skill what skill is being
And here, the overall scores, I don't really know if it's just like a composite score that is average. Here, is all items.
Speaking
right? Oh, this is for diagnostic then. Like this breakdown is for diagnostic. Yes, this overall score is only for that.
But how is this score like given? It's like average by averaging like all the scores here, or it's just like blah. This score and then
or
break it down.
Weighted average.
It's interesting. Too detailed actually.
Oh, it's just one page.
Pearson.
So this one
is skill mastery 9 times the reading score. So that's reading. It's only for reading. So skill 1 to 9 reading skills.
Probably
that's so weird. Not determined master. Not determined.
I think it's a gray area. That's because it's so 0.5, so it's very likely that students can master or cannot.
We don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting.
All right, so just another minute or so, try to think about those last two questions about how could stakeholders like learners and teachers understand the score report? And then more specifically, what could you do with this information? What sort of decisions could you make about a person based on this the score report that you're looking at?
I think based on the rubric, information.
I think this one might be easier. Like because it has everything.
It's just you don't know why you are.
Yeah, because the first thing that you can see is that compared to your overall score and which skill can
Here is more short description of what my listening skills is like. Even if I get an overall score of my listening,
yeah,
you don't know how good it is.
I think TOEFL has that. But it's like
but it's like short, really short.
And
no.
The description of
we're looking for description.
Because for this one you are only given like a number. So you don't really know what it means. But for TOEFL, you have like at this level, you will be able to.
I'll do that.
Yeah.
Or is it more of a you may not provide enough specific report?
Is there any?
This one is more detailed. like there's a list of different skills. It's
Just
in
for
reading,
just for reading.
just for reading.
Or
Reading
is it
test.
more about
And
like
it's
what you
item-based.
did or
Yeah.
what you can do?
Okay,
So
Like,
each
you
item
get
is
it
mapped
correct.
onto a
or
certain.
Yeah.
can do
Ah.
things.
Yeah.
I think that's can do. I couldn't understand.
And for each item, is it like weighted or
We don't
equally
know.
weighted or
Taking
We
this
don't
away from
know.
you.
We don't know.
So this one, understand common concrete facts and vocabulary. Understand living units. These things you should consider you did the these things you could do, but they don't really talk about what you can do. So it only talks about what you can do, but not what you can't. What you can't.
All right, so let's take a look at some of these together now that you've had a little bit of time to pore over these. And I'm hearing a lot of very language tester discussion about, you know, how are these scores calculated or weighted? And that's good. Those are the kinds of questions language testers will ask. But let's also take a look at these and try to think from the perspective of stakeholders, people who will make decisions based on these score reports. So who had this this one called diagnosis?
I have it.
You have it. Okay. So we'll take a closer look at this together, and we can see here that it's, well, what is it a test of, Xiaowan?
Someone.
What? What is it?
What is it a test of?
Was it a test about?
Reading.
Reading.
Yeah, reading, right? So it's narrowed down to one skill, one major skill, and then what are some of the things that sort of stood out to you on the first page here?
It has item level information, which is not very common for standardized tests. I guess it's because of diagnostic tests. That's why we get detailed information about how students are doing with each test item. So you can see their answers and whether their answers to each item is correct or not. And also there's a difficulty description. So I don't really know what EMH actually meant. But
EMH.
yeah, but I guess like easy, medium, and hard, right?
Yeah, that's right here. It's kind of small text, but easy, medium, hard.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah. And let me see. Yeah, and there's a total score there, and so I guess it's just that you don't really see a lot of tests that have this kind of test reports where you get breakdown scores for each item. Right.
Yeah, that's sort of a unique thing about this one. It's actually, you know, the very first thing that you see is how you did on each item. And then there's a lot of really detailed information, all these little codes and letters. And then I kind of like this skill mastery thing here on the bottom. You know, for each of these skills, you have to look on the backside to know what each skill is, but it shows you which ones you've mastered and which ones you probably haven't mastered.
It's also interesting the probability part. I guess it's based on IRT, but it's weird. Like there's a gray area which is tagged as not determined. So I guess students who are not familiar with IRT, it might confuse them. They will be like, "Why is not determined? I've already taken this test, and you're telling me you can't determine my skill level, and what does it mean?" So this got me a bit confused at first as well.
Yeah, there are a lot of things about this score report that I think would be hard, especially for learners to interpret, understand and then interpret, and even for teachers. I mean, you know, this is from research done by Eunice Zhang based on a preliminary version of the TOEFL called Language, and she did some really complicated, really well done modeling of responses. She used a variation of IRT called fusion modeling to do cognitive diagnostic modeling. We'll talk about this a little more later. But this is a really technical report, and then on the back you have kind of more explanatory information. You know, what are these skills? A flag is used to indicate ones you need to improve on. I almost think some of this information should go on the first page because it actually tells people what they need to work on.
Right.
And as far as, what could you do with this? Well, maybe as a teacher, if you had, you're working one-on-one with a student, you might see some things that need to be practiced, or if you know some good ways of teaching these skills. But if you look a little closer at what these skills are, like inferring major arguments or comprehending text implicit information at a global level, that's not exactly easy for a teacher to immediately know what that is, or more importantly, what to do about that, even though, there is a lot of really good detail in this report. So now let's take a look at a more familiar type of score report, the TOEFL one. So who had the TOEFL score report?
I did.
Great. So what is the TOEFL assessing? What can you tell us about the TOEFL based on this score report?
I think from the report itself, it's very difficult for me to really know how good the candidate's English is.
Mm-hmm.
If it's a one-to-one discussion about what the person is really good at, some part of the English skills, I think for me a better way is to meet the person personally instead of just reading the reports.
Mm-hmm.
But I think from a management perspective, if I'm going to make a decision for a group of students, like maybe 100, 200, I think this can help me a little bit. But
Mm-hmm.
I still need to maybe select some of the candidates to really see the report is about.
Right. Yeah. No, those are some really good comments about the decisions. And I think you're really spot on. The TOEFL is most useful when you're dealing with large numbers of people and you need to make kind of broad decisions. So for example, you could, maybe use a TOEFL to place people into levels of a language program, or most commonly to decide whether or not to admit them for university studies. This sample examinee, you can see her sort of profile, if you will, here. You see a total score and you see part scores. So for each of the sort of primary skills, reading, listening, speaking, and writing. And this is really, all the information is right here. This is really all you can do with a TOEFL score. This is all you get. There's some explanation down here, which is nice. It kind of puts those numbers in a little bit of perspective. So lets you know that, a reading score of 17 is kind of an intermediate level of reading ability. And it kind of talks about some things you can probably do. But it's not really detailed. Again, because it's not the point of TOEFL. It's more of a kind of broad strokes, how good at the language are you? So, decisions would be placement or admissions, that sort of thing. Now, we'll look at another test that's similar to the TOEFL. We'll look at the PTE. Who had this score report?
Melody.
Okay.
Melody, okay.
Yes. So
tell me a little bit about what you saw.
So a little bit under at the bottom of this page, we can see first of all the overall score and also the very detailed information. Not very detailed information, some information about the skills profile. So I think something very interesting to me is this graph, because we can see how good the students is at each skills relative to the overall score. But to me, I don't really know what the overall score means, because I can see where the student is on the whole scale, but I don't really know any other information about what's the overall scores like stands for. And I think there are two, they kind of like break it down to communicative skills and enabling skills. I don't really know how these skills are assessed in the tests, but I was wondering how the grammar and this oral proficiency is just based on the raters' perceptions, or is based on some very exact measures of the students, like communication skills, or what?
Yeah, so with the PTE, they do have a website and a brochure that explains how the scores are calculated. So like TOEFL, you can get more information about that. Maybe learners aren't going to look that up, which can be a problem, but there is a systematic way in which they get these scores out. But yeah, it's interesting. PTE is doing something a little bit extra here. Like TOEFL, you get an overall score and you get this skill profile with your typical 4 skills. But then you get these enabling skills. And what's interesting is Pearson doesn't call these diagnostic, but they talk about them in very diagnostic terms. They talk about these are, strengths or weaknesses you might have and things you might want to work on to improve your overall language ability. So like this test taker who had a relatively low speaking score, also had pretty low oral fluency and sort of low pronunciation relative to his kind of overall ability. So those might be areas he would work on. So as a learner or teacher, you might be able to take away a little something from that, still at a pretty broad level, but getting a little more specific than I need to work on speaking, you're getting a little bit of maybe the why that speaking score is low. To answer your question about how they get those scores, some of it, so actually Pearson's test is pretty much all computer scored, if I recall correctly. So they're able to take certain automated measures of oral fluency and whatnot, and they assign scale scores to those and combine, make a composite. For things like grammar and spelling, again, automated measures, I think are what drive a lot of it. And they might even get some information from the multiple choice questions or the select response questions from the receptive skills too. It's a pretty sophisticated test. Like a lot of these sort of larger scale tests that try to add a little bit more, their methods are really interesting, but even with this approach, we're seeing some limitations. You can only do so much with this information. So next, let's take a look. Did anybody have the this very plain looking one called reading assessment with ODAS or ODA at the top?
Got it.
Rio? Okay. So what was your impression of this score report?
To me, it was actually was comparing this one with TOEFL, and to me it was more helpful in terms of like teachers, because it kind of provides you a list of what you can do and cannot do. And on the first page, there's actually overall score, and also understanding of you, where you are at the current level and the target level. But subsequent to that, you have a series of things like the skills, and it tells you how much you can actually, probably the questions, what proportion of you can actually score correctly and so on. And I like that in terms of, it can, as a teacher, it can inform you in terms of like what learners, or I think this is the one you took yourself.
Yeah.
So you can kind of know that which kind of things you have to work on as a learner, and also probably as a teacher.
Yeah, those are all really good comments. This is one that I took. You can see the date here. This was, over a year ago. The test time is really long. I started it one afternoon and then finished it the next morning, I think. So that's not a good measure. But yeah, it gave me an overall proficiency level. That's 2 on ILR, so that's like ACTFL advanced. And it told me how I did at my target level, my current level, and then how I did at questions or passages that were at the next level, like advanced high. And yeah, some of the information is actually quite similar to that first one we looked at, the diagnosis. Gave me a score on how I did with the main idea questions, supporting ideas, and so on. But what I thought was really interesting is it gets at some vocabulary things, some linguistic things. So total vocabulary by subject area, which I think is a really neat way of providing feedback. So this is from the Defense Language Institute out in Monterey. They use this with their personnel. And of course, they have to learn about things like politics and security. I did okay with like culture and politics, surprisingly, but security stuff, like military stuff, I don't know that very well in Korean. So if I were a soldier, I would want to study that vocabulary a little bit more. So for me, this is maybe the most actionable information in a score report we've seen so far. It even gets really specific at the level of like grammatical or discourse features. Again, these N sizes are a little bit small. I failed to recognize the atypical use of a common conjunction or conjunctive particle, but there's only one of those, so I don't know how much I can generalize that, and so on and so forth. And then for the harder questions, you know, I'm doing a bit worse from the harder passages. I guess I could, you know, learn more about famous people or something. But yeah, it gives a little more to chew on, a little more that's relevant to instruction. So the last one, I believe, is this one, your Korean pronunciation. Did anybody take a look at this, or was it the odd one out?
No, nobody look at. Sorry, you can walk us through this.
It's okay. We'll come back to it later. I'll just go over it real quick. So this is from the pilot version of my dissertation test, and I use a pilot one because it's in English. When I gave score reports in connection with my dissertation, everything was in Korean and nobody can read that. But basically, it starts off on the first page, and I don't give them any numbers. I just tell them what their difficulties are, specifically with Korean segmental pronunciation. So these are sounds that they would need to work on, practice, get some help with. And similarly, some phonological features that would benefit from some practice. So I tried to really front that. And then on the back side, they get a little more detailed. They get information on which questions they missed. These are the stimulus or the stem or whatever you want to call it from each question they missed for a certain sound in pronunciation and in hearing. So I'll talk a little bit more detail about this later. But the idea here is I don't even want to tell people how good they are overall, because I don't think the test I built is appropriate for telling them that. And again, we'll get into that a little bit more later. So I'm going to try to switch back to the PowerPoint now. Let's see. Okay. And so the reason I started with these score reports is, again, because when you want to talk about test use, when you want to talk about how stakeholders use a test and not just how language testers make the test or analyze the test, you really, I think score reports are a good starting point for kind of when the test leaves our hands and goes into the hands of the users. So that sort of, I think, is a really important idea for diagnostic language assessment. And let's talk a little bit first, you know, what is diagnostic language assessment? I'm drawing mainly on the work of Charles Alderson and his colleagues, but they emphasize that it's a process, and it's one that's oriented to learning, and it's focused on the smaller components of communicative skills. And really the main, I'd say the overarching sort of goal here is to evaluate learners' strengths and weaknesses. So overall levels of proficiency are much, much less important, if at all. The main thing you want to do is try to figure out what people are good or not so good at, because that's how you use these test results. You use it to inform learning. So what is it in a nutshell, or how would you categorize it? It's a type of formative assessment. And I think it also fits in the sort of larger framework of learning-oriented assessment. Formative and learning-oriented assessment are pretty closely related. They sort of go hand in hand. In a lot of ways, I think diagnostic language assessment is one of the better kinds of learning-oriented assessment because it most appropriately draws on language testers' expertise and doesn't try to impose language testing on regular classroom practice. It's a support tool for teachers and learners. Diagnostic assessment, though, in practice, it's one of those things that it's listed in about every language testing textbook. You know, there are 4 or 5 types of language tests. You have your proficiency tests, your achievement tests, your, you know, whatever, and then diagnostic is listed usually as one of those. But then people don't actually use them that much. But let's dig a little deeper into what are we talking about with diagnostic assessment. So Alderson's book from 14 years ago This is basically about the Dialang test, which you might be familiar with. It's a free online diagnostic test offered in 14 different European languages. And when talking about this, his sort of theory, his guiding principles, he talks about how diagnostics are based on a detailed theory of language development. Okay, so it shouldn't just be a detailed theory of, what is the construct of listening or reading. You also need to account for how do those skills develop. So there's an SLA interface here with diagnostic assessment, which I think is really interesting. He also suggested that diagnostic tests are likely to be discrete and focus on specific elements, linguistic elements most often, rather than global language abilities. So in this sort of way of looking at diagnostics, it might sort of scare some people that we'd be going back to the sort of, what would be like John Carroll and Fries and Sapon kind of old school 1960s, 70s language tests, very discrete. But we'll get to that. There's a reason for doing this. And part of that reason is that diagnostic tests should focus on lower level, kind of bottom up language skills or processing skills, rather than the higher order integrated skills. And I think the reasoning here is that these lower level things are a little more teachable, they're a little more concrete, whereas higher order and integrated skills, I'm sure you had a great talk from Leah last week, but it was, I imagine, talked a lot about, comparing information, comparing schema across texts and sort of these very abstract ideas, things that are harder to pick apart and harder to teach, at least explicitly, harder to develop in a language classroom, perhaps. And then a lot of these ideas were refined further by Alderson and colleagues. This was an article in Applied Linguistics from a few years back. And they lay out 5 key principles. So first is that a test user ultimately diagnoses, not the test. So somebody has to be involved in deciding to give the diagnostic test. Somebody has to interpret those results and make some decisions about, are these problems that the test is showing me, are they real? Do I believe them? What should I do with them? And so forth. So users are important. Then diagnostic instruments should again be targeted and discrete. This is sort of reiterating what he said in 2005. Diagnostics should take account of multiple perspectives, including learners' perspective. So he specifically maps out a role for self-assessment. And this all kind of comes together in 4 stages. So observation, you can kind of think of this as a teacher observing a student most often. And recognizing that, something's a little off here, or somebody's having a kind of significant difficulty here. And then there might be some initial informal assessment. So this might be maybe the teacher making notes or paying a little more attention to the student, kind of sort of doing kind of micro in the moment assessment a little more often. And then finally the teacher, will keep going with this kind of perspective, might decide, I'm going to give this student a test because there's something going on here and I want to find out more information before I make some decisions. And then finally comes decision making. So again, the decisions are part of the process of diagnostic assessment. And what I think is the nice link here is that decisions are also part of validity arguments for assessments in general, right? We have to talk about decisions in the way we use tests. Diagnostic assessment makes that very explicit, that it's not just part of a validity argument, it's part of the whole assessment procedure to make these decisions. And then these decisions should be really connected to future instruction. This is a point that Youngwon Lee also emphasized in the special issue of language testing from 4 years back. And so from that special issue, it's interesting. I actually just I went over to meet with Youngwon Lee today. We had lunch and I sat in on his class at Seoul University, and he had this quote, and this was 4 years ago now. He really hoped that this special issue would inspire language testers to develop, evaluate, revise, refine both the theoretical frameworks and the practical applications of DLA in years to come. Well, I don't know how many people followed through with that, but he hooked me into the idea. So there's at least one dissertation. There's actually a couple others. The recent LTRC, there's some students of Uta Kanak in Australia who are doing some diagnostic stuff. And then some of Carol Chappelle's students, one or two of them are working on diagnostics too. So hopefully this momentum starts to build. And I think people are coming together to agree mostly with the Alderson and colleague framework for diagnostic assessment. And that's the one I tend to follow as well. So what is not DLA? Well, some of these are very obvious, but proficiency tests are not diagnostic. The TOEFL is not diagnostic. There are some TOEFL research reports. They are trying to add more diagnostic information to their tests score reports, whether it's the TOEFL or TOEFL Junior Primary, you know, all these tests. They want to give a little more information, which I think is good. And I think you can call it diagnostic information, but it's still not a diagnostic assessment. And that's sort of the second bullet there. This also applies to, I think, the cognitive diagnostic models, which I have a little more to say about that. Achievement testing is not diagnostic. It can be formative in some ways. Achievement tests certainly can be formative when they're tied to learning objectives and you have a midterm and then a final and so forth. But that's a different kind of learning-oriented assessment. It's not exactly diagnostic. Of course, placement tests, entrance exams. Entrance exams warrant a little discussion because there are some tests that I'll talk about in a minute that are used as entrance or post-entrance exams. And they're really functioning as screening tests. So either screening people in or out of university or screening people who've been admitted into sort of very broad level instructional programs like English, academic English support and so forth. That's good. These are all, none of these tests are bad. They're just not diagnostic in the Alderson framework. And then personality testing is something that comes in to discussions of diagnostics sometime. And I think it's interesting. Even in some of Alderson's work, they do things like give working memory tests because that's a relevant cognitive ability to reading comprehension. Personality can be things like, you know, motivation. We know that's important for language learning. So there's these sort of cognitive, non-linguistic, personality-related variables that could relate to learning a language, but they might not really qualify as diagnostic because how do you change somebody's working memory or how do you change someone's personality? There might be some avenues where a teacher can give counseling to a student if their motivation is lacking or change their classroom practice to be more motivating, but it's very, very borderline, I think, in terms of diagnostic quality. So what are some current examples of diagnostic assessments? There's the Dialang, which I've mentioned. If you haven't seen it before, you can play with it. You can just Google Dialang. I think Lancaster University hosts it now. And if you're familiar at all with any European language, including English, you can kind of try it out and see how it works. There's also the DELNA, the Diagnostic English Language, I forget what the N is, but then assessment. They use this in Australia and New Zealand as a post-entrance test for second language speakers to determine who might need some academic English support. There's a Delta, which is used, I think, for similar purposes in Hong Kong. And there's the Dialuki project. Alderson et al. Wrote a book on this for diagnosing second and foreign language reading, but I haven't seen the actual test. It's more of a research project. The ODA, I showed you the score report from my Korean reading test. That's another one that you can go try out. You might have to make an account, but they let you do it and you can try it out. NetProf is a cool one. It gets a little bit away from a formal assessment or what we think of as a test. It's a pronunciation intelligent tutor, and they offer it in several different languages. Again, it's the military. But over time of using this tutor, it gives you feedback on which phonemes in your target language you have more or less accuracy with. So I see that as actually being sort of diagnostic assessment really integrated into a learning tool. I also think ETS Criterion counts as a sort of diagnostic assessment. Are you all familiar with Criterion?
I think it's widely used in Japan.
Rio, have you used it?
No.
So what it is it's a kind of a learning or practice program for the TOEFL writing. And teachers can use it with classes, or learners can use it by themselves, but they write TOEFL-style essays, and then they get an automated score, an overall score, but then they also get really detailed grammar and kind of organization type of feedback on their actual essay. And one of the cool things I think you can do with this is when a learner gets an essay back that's been marked up by this AI feedback machine, they can revise their essay and then resubmit it to try to get a better overall score and see if they can fix some of the problems they've had in their writing. So it's very detailed and it's very, I think, learning oriented. The last one I'll give an example of is a vocabulary size test. And I think for a long time, these have actually had diagnostic uses. So this is something like what Paul Nation has put together, if you're familiar with his work. You take this test and it tells you how many English vocabulary words you know, and you can use that information because they've made really good links between vocabulary size and graded readers or other reading materials. So if you have, you can use this to sort of pick out books that will help you develop your reading skills and acquire vocabulary that's kind of in your range. And so I think there's some neat applications there. Actually, Benjamin Kreml, who's now at the University of Innsbruck, he was one of Norbert Schmidt's students and also one of Alderson's students. He did a dissertation on basically a vocabulary size test, but he's trying to look at it more from a diagnostic perspective. So I think it's a really interesting and existing way of diagnosing language abilities. You can find weaknesses in vocabulary in terms of overall size, also frequency bands, which you might struggle with. A lot of learners tend to master the first 2,000, but then the next the 3,000 and 4,000 bands in English are weak. And then they pick up at 5, 6, 7 because that's the academic vocabulary. So there's all these sort of weird in the middle words. Again, for people who want to develop their vocabulary to support all their language skills, that gives some indication of where should I start looking for vocabulary to study. So I think some nice things going on there. Now, cognitive diagnostic assessment, I think, is something that needs to be dealt with. This has been done most prolifically, I think, by Eunice Zhang, who's at the University of Toronto at OISE, the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education. Also by Yongwon Lee and some of his colleagues. Again, when he was at ETS, him and Yasuko Sawaki did some really interesting work in this area. And this was all in the spirit of trying to make proficiency tests or standardized achievement tests in public schools more informative. But I think there's, again, and actually a lot of this work is really rigorous. A lot of the analyses they do to sort of investigate how people use the scores has been really good, and they've been very honest about this. I think Eunice Zhang's work really stands out for this. Her 2009 paper and the 2015 paper, they're really excellent. She's looking more now at how learners, like children, interpret feedback, diagnostic feedback from standardized sort of school district or province level assessments. So again, it's really high quality work, technically sophisticated, really amazing, but it doesn't connect to learning so cleanly. And there's some issues with, again, what can you do with the information from these sophisticated models? Can a learner, can your typical classroom teacher apply this? I think those are some important questions, and ones that maybe, and I think Eunice Zhang has said as much, there are some major limitations into how diagnostic these kind of approaches can be, just because it's really hard to, again, do much with the information.
Then if it's a cognitive diagnostic test, is it for diagnosing cognitive disabilities in children, where it's just, it's not for that purpose?
No, not expressly. That I'd have to look. That might be where it got its start, but the idea is that for whatever sort of mental ability you're primarily measuring, The idea is that there's probably several subcomponents or sub-skills, cognitive, something that exists in your mind, these little operations, these little sub-skills, these little sub-knowledge bases that all come together to form this construct, this larger ability. And so, yeah, it's not about diagnosing cognitive disability. That's one unfortunate thing about diagnostic language assessment. The word diagnostic or diagnosis, when we're talking about people, kind of makes people think of doctors and psychologists and that sort of thing. So it's a little bit unfortunate, but no, it's not that, to answer your question. It's more or less like we saw with the diagnosis feedback report, looking at sub-skills like understanding main ideas, understanding author's purpose, connecting inferences, things like that. So, yeah, some issues I've been grappling with lately, kind of in the larger idea of diagnostic assessment and related to my dissertation, as we've just been talking about measurement models and techniques. So you can do really sophisticated things with diagnostic goals in mind, like cognitive diagnostic modeling. These are all basically multidimensional IRT models. You need lots of data. You also have to define item attributes. It's a really rigorous process. It's really cool, but it's not always practical, and it might not give you information that you can do much with. Eunice Jong had a really great interview with Glenn Fulcher on his podcast, where she talks about maybe it's time for less rigorous, less restrictive measurement models to get a little more use in diagnostic assessment, because they might line up better with the practical and sort of pedagogical concerns that diagnostic assessment prioritizes. So I kind of agree there, and that's sort of what I've done. Another issue is extrapolation. In Alderson's framework, they say get discrete, narrow it down to lower level skills and processes. But how do you extrapolate that to real world, tests like that? How do you extrapolate that to real world language ability? With most tests, when we're looking at extrapolation of test results or test performance, it's almost straightforward at this point. We can say, the tasks on this test are very similar to the tasks in the university or in real life. We can say, the language produced by candidates on this test is very similar in its discourse features to language from real life. That's kind of straightforward. But say, for example, if you're diagnosing, like I am, phonology, basically, if I'm looking at a very narrow view of phoneme accuracy in very limited contexts, how much can I expect that to transfer to spontaneous, connected speech? I'm not sure. That's something I'm sort of throwing my hands up, or just sort of saying, well, there's got to be limitations to extrapolation from many diagnostic tests. Another big issue is grain size, interpretability, and utility of results. Basically the feedback. How detailed can you get without overwhelming learners? How technical can you get without overwhelming people? And at the same time, at what point does your information not stop being useful because it's too general? It's kind of a Goldilocks problem. This diagnostic feedback is too hard. This diagnostic feedback is too general. This diagnostic feedback is just right. I understand it. I can do something with it. And again, I think that connects directly into the next issue, is instruction and learning. So yeah, it's part of the validity argument, for sure. But when we think about good language study, good language teaching, are language testers really the right people to do that kind of research? I feel in my case, to defend my own research, I have some experience as a language teacher, so I'm not totally unqualified, but I think there are, I think research and practice in diagnostic assessment could really be enhanced by bringing teachers into the fold, maybe even to the point of, asking teachers to help us design the kind of feedback that is given to stakeholders. Because I think that diagnosis report that we saw, the very first one, you know, it had all this like probability information, super, super detailed codes for each response. I think that's maybe something where having a teacher perspective would have been really helpful to improve that kind of score report. So I know we only have a few minutes left. I figured I'm going to give my dissertation defense in about a month. Some of you maybe saw my practice talk earlier. So I'm not leaving a lot of time here for my diagnostic, but I'll show you kind of what it's about real quick and kind of show you some of the analyses I've been doing. So again, I'm trying to diagnose Korean pronunciation, and I'm now on the third version of the test. So I went through 2 rounds of piloting back at Michigan State, and then field testing with my operational version here in Korea with a larger number of learners. So the test itself has 2 sections, production and perception. My reasoning there is that we know from speech learning research, from L2 phonological acquisition research, that perception and production have a learning connection. It's not always one-to-one or always causal, but generally if you can't perceive a sound, you will not be able to produce it consistently and intelligibly all the time. So including both sides lets you hopefully come to some useful instructional decisions. So for example, I'll use an English phoneme, but like if I can't hear, if I don't distinguish the sound P very well, I might want to work on some listening practice, maybe distinguishing between P and B or P and V. And then that will support my pronunciation learning too. I have 4 tasks. So the first production task is a picture naming task. I'm not sure if this audio will go through. Were you able to hear that?
We can't hear it.
Yeah.
Can't hear it. Probably not very well. So anyway, somebody sees a picture, they say the word, and if the way it's scored is each phoneme in the word is scored as intelligible or not, clear or not. It doesn't have to be native-like, but if it was ambiguous, it would be scored wrong. Was that a aspirated T or a lax unaspirated T? Wasn't sure, but the other sounds were fine. The second production task is non-word reading. So this is reading syllables that are completely transparent in how you should pronounce them. Korean's much better than English. There's better grapheme to phoneme mapping, but there are still some real words or connected speech in Korean where things don't line up. I controlled for that. Everything's transparent here. So they should be saying shi, which is has a tensed first phoneme. And they say something like she, which was not tensed, it gets scored as incorrect. Moving on to the perception side, these are sort of mirror images in a way of the production tasks. The first perception task is a little more holistic. It's pronunciation judgment. So they see a picture. We all see that this is Japan. This is just the default one I use. Rio, I didn't put this in just for you, but it's there for you now. So the Korean word for Japan is ilbon, and what they hear, and again, I don't know if you'll be able to hear this, but they hear a speaker say ilbon with a tensed P phoneme, which is incorrect. So they should judge that that word was pronounced incorrectly. Because I know which phoneme was pronounced incorrectly, I get to make an inference about their knowledge of that phoneme. And then the last one is an identification task. It's really simple, but they hear a sound and then they choose the Korean letters that match the sound. So if they hear something like ul, so they should choose on the left, which is that UL combination there, not U, which has a similar place of articulation, not exactly, something they could have been confused with. So that's the test. And then they get out a report like this. This is annotated because it's in Korean, but these were the ones I gave out to all of my participants. And so it's kind of like the one we saw, gives the kind of take-home message on page 1, what you should work on. And then on page 2, it gives more detailed numeric information and also examples of words they got wrong in production or perception. So I not only have a couple minutes here, but my validation study, I go through a whole validity argument. I try to collect information at each step. I have a couple things to share about just a couple of these inferences, explanation, and utilization. I'm just going to go real quick here. Sorry, guys. I know you have places to be. Again, I gave the test to a lot of people, and then I interviewed a smaller group 2 times over the course of a few months. They did a self-assessment for each phoneme and their overall pronunciation abilities, and then I had these interviews. Blah, blah. So explanation, there were some theoretical and empirical suggestions that certain phonemes should be more difficult than others. Oops, this has the Korean letters. I do have one with IPA symbols, but basically things largely worked out as they should. Certain vowels that were cross-linguistically common were extremely easy, but then Korea's tensed consonants, which they're kind of down here, these double characters, those were the most difficult to produce, as you would expect. So again, things are lining up as you'd expect for second language learners. Yeah. And then identifying diagnostic profiles. Did the results separate people out in a meaningful way? This slide here shows 4 clusters. I did a cluster analysis on all the phoneme scores. And we can see here that cluster 3, it's very green. These people have very few problems, whereas the other clusters have some different problems. So there are people who have more problems with tensed sounds. There are people who have more problems with aspirated sounds. Some people have problems with a particular vowel. Some people have problems with a particular nasal sound. This gets a little clearer if you show it as diagnostic flags. So what are the things that show up on that take-home message, what you should study? Some of these groups are almost uniform in their difficulties. And there are some interpretations for these clusters, you know, what kind of problems they have and so forth. And it's not strictly, you know, a major L1 group dominating every cluster. It tends to be fairly distributed. There are some L1 patterns, though, that you might expect. And then raising learner awareness, looking at self-assessments. So this plot, I think, is interesting. It shows on the x-axis the correlation between their KPD score for perception and their self-assessed perception. So across all the phonemes, how did that correlate? And then on the y-axis, it's for production. So you see that there's a spread here. Each point is 1 learner. Ideally, if learners had perfect self-assessment, they'd be on that line. But as you can see, there's a lot of people who aren't on that line. And there's some people down here who have very limited accuracy, very limited discrimination in understanding which phonemes are actually difficult or easy for them. Some of them have it backwards even. So these are people who could certainly be helped by a good score report. Similarly for accuracy, it's kind of the same pattern. Some people were really accurate. Many people were less accurate overall in their overall self-assessments. Last thing real quick, what were people doing with the score reports? So this comes from my interview data. How did they understand them? Some people, I couldn't avoid some linguistic terms, and unsurprisingly, they didn't know these linguistic terms. So they didn't know what a tensed sound was. But in a lot of cases, people said, this all seems right, or they were surprised and like, wow, I had no idea. This is really helpful. And then utilizing the results, so I had 14 people come back about 3 or 4 months later, and I asked them, well, after I gave you those results, did you do anything to work on your pronunciation? And some of them did. They did some really good things. They started paying attention to the way their teacher pronounced particular sounds. Attention is shown to be useful for phonological learning. They started using Google to try to distinguish their sounds they have trouble with, Google's speech-to-text recognition. They talked with their teachers. One person even showed their report to their teacher and asked for regular feedback on her pronunciation. One person even hired a tutor for a month. She was very insecure about her pronunciation, and I think the report sort of motivated her to take that next step. But then there were some people who didn't do much. They were studying for proficiency tests, a couple of them, and the Korean version of TOEFL, the Korean equivalent, actually doesn't have a speaking section. So they weren't really working on pronunciation because they didn't need to. Their most immediate need was writing, reading, and listening. So that's it. I'll talk more about this at my dissertation defense at the end of, or at the beginning of May. But yeah, I'll go ahead and stop there so I don't keep you all too long. Thanks. And if you have time you want to hang out and ask questions, I'll hang out for a few more minutes too. But if you need to go, I totally understand.
Thank you so much, Dan.
Yeah, no, but it was interesting.
So then I had to go to I have to run to the data question.
No worries. Take care.
Yeah, thank you, man.
Can I? Yeah.
Okay. Yes, I have one question.
Sure.
Dan, it's very interesting study and project, and really appreciate. And one question I have is that when you give the diagnostic feedback to those participants, it's just based on their individual performance, or it's just based on the patterns that you identified from your, I don't know, the cluster analysis? Because you find that maybe with some forming the students, the reason why the students, it's hard for them is just that they cannot distinguish between two sounds, and maybe for others it's just like maybe they're something wrong with their perceptions. So how did you actually provide this kind of feedback? It's just
yeah. So the feedback that each student gets is just based on their scores. I don't reference any norms. And the cluster analysis was a post hoc thing. It was just looking at a kind of quantitative way of looking at, can the test identify some different profiles? And so, yeah, they just get feedback based on their own performance. I used a sort of arbitrary criterion for giving them a flag for something to show up on that first page. Mm-hmm. It was just if they had less than 75% accuracy. And that's sort of arbitrary, but I figure, well, if they can only pronounce a phoneme accurately 3 out of 4 times, they might have fairly frequent issues with that phoneme in real language use, and it might lead to some intelligibility problems. It is arbitrary, though, but it's also a way of narrowing down the field so that learners weren't totally overwhelmed.
Yeah, because I noticed that on one of your slides, you were dealing with
Dan, sorry to interrupt. I have to go now, and we're using my laptop, so I'm gonna leave my laptop with Cindy, and it's still being recorded, so remember to save it.
Okay, sure.
Okay, so thanks, Xiaowan.
Yeah, because I noticed that you were dealing with like very heterogeneous participant population. Like some of them are Chinese, and some of them are, I cannot remember very clearly. Do you think that their L1 can have kind of like impact on the type of difficulty that they may have with formations or?
Yeah. Everybody asks this. Well, not everybody, but I get this question a lot. And yeah, there are some broad L1 patterns. Sure, we know that L1 influences L2 pronunciation, but it can influence people in different ways, and it's only one variable. You also have things like different levels of experience, formal instruction, informal self-study. Some of the people who listen to a lot of K-pop and watch all the dramas, they end up with some good pronunciation, some of them. Whereas some of their fellow countrymen who don't do as much for fun or socializing with the language don't get those benefits, obviously. The other issue that I think is sort of interesting and I think relevant is that, especially Korean, with the sort of population I was working with, it's almost never learned as an L2. It's learned as an L3, an L4, an L5, sometimes even an L6. Because I was working with adult learners of Korean, and who, almost 100% of them started learning the language in their mid to late teens or later. So critical period's gone, right? And they, some of them, like I had one participant from Hong Kong. Her first language is Cantonese. She speaks English second best, then Mandarin, then Japanese. Korean is like her 5th language. And, she asked me, because she asked about L1 too, And she asked, well, where would the influence come from? Which language? And I said, that's a really good question. We don't know exactly yet. So again, my focus is on individuals. I think the L1 influence is interesting and something, you know, people look at a lot in L2 phonology and speech research, but it's actually not my main concern. I'm more interested in individuals. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Hi.
Yeah.
First,
Hi.
You did. I think this research is very practical for learners to improve their pronunciation, especially Korea. I have some specific questions, but first, is the diagnostic assessment based on a cell phone? Is a cell phone platform, mobile platform, or PC? I don't know, how did you?
Yeah, so I went a little bit low tech with it. Actually, the production parts, I did it with PowerPoint, and then I had a handheld recorder. And the perception parts, I did use a sort of a computer program. It's like a psychological experiment program, but I was able to build the perception tasks in it. Yeah, I didn't go super sophisticated. I sort of wanted to, you know, I used like that psychological software, experiment software for my own benefit. But I think I could have just done a paper answer sheet and done the perception tasks on PowerPoint too. Because my thinking was, well, one, I don't have the resources to do like an automated speech recognition sort of fancy smartphone or computer version. People are, I think, going to be working in those areas. But I also thought, well, if this is going to be practical, if it's going to be something that can be used by classroom teachers, ideally, I haven't made it yet, but it could be transferred to a very low-tech, kind of low-resource friendly format where all you would need is speakers and maybe a hand recorder and an answer sheet, you know, that kind of thing. And then a teacher could punch in the scores in Excel and sort of get the diagnostic information coming out. That was sort of my thinking with that.
Yeah, I think technology part is not main concern presently. As we know, technology is automatic speech recognition is quite fairly advanced now. As long as you have the data, the right amount of data, the data is large enough, you can get the technology to turn your data into practical application. I think technology is not the problem. I think the main issue, I think, is how to recognize, or how do you provide the right kind of feedback. That is, how is your diagnostic language assessment different from learning feedback or learning feedback system?
It's not in some ways. I think what the diagnostic assessment though does is it gives a kind of bigger picture snapshot, and kind of lets you make some higher level planning decisions, perhaps, compared to just feedback like in situ sort of, whether it's from a teacher or from a learning program, that responds to one specific error or mistake at one moment in time, whereas the diagnostic feedback sort of tries to take a bigger picture, kind of profile your abilities in some skill area at one point in time. And then, you know, you could use the diagnostic again a bit later and kind of look at improvement, whereas I think a lot of feedback systems, whether that's teacher or computer, they're very concerned with in the moment, and it's useful in the moment, and they're dynamic. You know, the kind of feedback a teacher gives to a student will change over time. The kind of feedback and sort of instructional programming that a computer will choose will change over time, but the diagnostic is sort of a little snapshot in time to hopefully help you make bigger decisions than, oh, how do I reformulate this to get the correct answer, or how do I oh, my teacher said it that way, I'll try saying it that way now. That's sort of a small piece, really useful, but I think kind of different from getting a bigger snapshot.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Another more general question, that is, I think a lot of research is inner transfer from the past to the present, kind of learning or learner-centeredness research, right? Just like your diagnostic language assessment, we were focusing more on learners. I want to ask you, how do you personally started to think about this kind of learner-centered?
Sure. Yeah, one of the motivations was I did a pronunciation instruction study with some Korean teachers at MSU, and it was kind of typical classroom-based, and where everybody in the class, it was sort of an extracurricular class, but they all got taught the same curriculum, the same things, and the effectiveness was limited. And I got to thinking, and especially when I was listening to these learner speech samples, I got to thinking, wow, some of these students, they're in the same level of Korean, they're from the same first language, but they have some different problems with pronunciation. And I thought, well, one reason maybe the whole class instruction wasn't so effective was because some people were getting things they didn't need. Other people weren't getting the things they did need, and maybe only a few people were getting taught the specific pronunciation aspects or bits that were helpful to them. And so that got me thinking more about individual learners. Yeah.
Thank you. I think more follow-up research can be done for this kind of area, I think. That is, how do you design this kind of follow-up learning tasks for students or learners who have problems with some kind of phonemes or some kind of specific learning tasks. Okay, so I think it's a very good idea.
Thanks. Yeah, and I agree completely. That's where the research needs to start going. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Dan. And sorry for keeping you so long, because I know it's pretty late in Korea right now. It's 11 p.m. something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not too bad
thank
yet.
you very much for agreeing to give us this talk. And
well, yeah, and thanks for coming in early.
We look
and
forward to seeing you soon. Yeah. Good luck.
Likewise.
Participation.
Alrighty.
Yes. See
Bye.
ya. Bye. I need to save this. Oh, how should I save this? There's a
Start recording. Still recording.
Oh, yes. Here. Okay.